We've spent $6 trillion just to keep hearing the same message. The Earth is dying, and it's up to the American people to fix it, with their wallets. That line, printed in red ink on the top of a classified memo, wasn't a media headline. It summarized over 10 years of unrestrained climate-related spending across Capitol Hill. Senator John Kennedy sat in his office, the pale blue glow of a computer screen lighting up the room. It was nearly midnight. The Senate was empty, but his lights were still on. Ron Johnson paced slowly nearby, holding a printout labeled Internal Unreviewed GAO Disbursement Summary. Behind them, 2 sets of data were displayed on the screen. On the left was the colorful curve of the IPCC's climate projections, smooth and steep. On the right, a black and white chart titled Vostok, showing over 440,000 years of atmospheric records, rugged and irregular. Kennedy didn't take his eyes off it. "We were handed a model," he muttered. "But this data tells another story. Run." Johnson stood by the window, tapping the glass, watching the Capitol dome glowing under the floodlights. "They spent over $6 trillion, he said. But no one ever measured the results. It was always about emergencies, disasters, sacrifices. But not once did they show how much the Earth actually cooled." He dropped a thick report onto the table. "This one's about northern forest fires. In just 1 year, natural wildfires there released more carbon than the entire U.S. economy did 2 decades ago. Yet the Inflation Reduction Act asks Americans to pay $1.2 trillion to cancel out only a portion of that." Kennedy didn't look away. "And the media said nothing," he added grimly. He opened another file on the computer, a PDF labeled World Climate Statement Restricted. The screen began to scroll, names of physicists, geologists, meteorologists. Over 2,800 scientists, including 2 Nobel Prize winners, had signed it. The statement said clearly, "There is no climate emergency." But the bottom of the screen read, "Access denied, Library of Congress archive." Kennedy's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "They didn't argue against it," he said. "They just made sure no one would see it." Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Hiding the truth through omission," he said. "And all the models we funded repeat the same claim. Man-made carbon is the problem. But if CO2 levels rise after temperature, like this chart shows, then we're chasing the wrong cause." Kennedy pointed at the Vostok chart. "Exactly." Johnson opened another folder. "Are you ready to take this public?" Kennedy nodded. "It doesn't belong in a drawer anymore." He placed a red folder labeled Witness Review, Energy and Climate Watch on the table and tapped it twice. "We need a public hearing." Johnson didn't hesitate. "Barrasso can clear the floor. He's seen some of this." Kennedy picked up the phone. One ring. Senator Barrasso speaking. "We've got credible evidence of false climate models, silence dissent, and $6 trillion spent without clear results. This needs to go public." There was a pause. Then Barrasso's calm voice answered, "I'll schedule it. You'll have chair, and the media won't be shut out." Kennedy hung up. The room went quiet. The CNN feed still played silently on the wall. The headline read, "UN Secretary General Climate Disaster at the Door." Kennedy turned it off. "They want disaster," he said. "Let's give them truth." He looked at Johnson. "Get the files. We're going public." Johnson nodded and walked out. Kennedy stayed at his desk, eyes locked on the glowing Vostok. Dirt outside Capitol Hill slept, but in that room something had begun. The morning sun poured into the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee chamber, but the atmosphere was already heavy. It was just after 9 a.m. when the gavel struck. Cameras snapped, screens flickered, and rows of press sat straight, waiting. Chairman John Barrasso began in a firm voice. "This committee is now in session. We're here to review federal climate spending, public climate models, and the reliability of scientific evaluations." He didn't speak loudly, but his words left a noticeable chill in the room. Senator John Kennedy sat to his left, his papers in perfect order, the red folder front and center. Ron Johnson leaned back slightly, arms crossed, quietly watching the Democrats across the room. Jamie Raskin stared ahead, his lips tight, seated between Ed Markey and Alex Padilla. Both of them flipped through notes, but said nothing. Raskin finally broke the silence. Mr. Chairman, I must object. This hearing isn't oversight, it's political theater. It's meant to question established science and delay practical solutions. Barrasso didn't flinch. Objection noted. The hearing continues. Kennedy stood without ceremony, lifted a single page, and walked to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, $6 trillion. That's what taxpayers have spent on climate programs. And not once has this chamber received a clear answer to the most basic question. What did we get in return? He turned to Raskin. Not slogans, not forecasts, real measurable results. Raskin raised a hand. The results are the disasters we avoided, the damage we reduced. That's the purpose of proactive action. Kennedy remained still. Then show the data. Because what I have shows that even the most aggressive climate spending in history hasn't changed a single observable global trend. He clicked on a screen behind him. The Vostok graph appeared. 400,000 years of ice core data. This is the planet's own record, Kennedy said. Temperature rises first, then CO2 follows. That's what this shows, every single time. Padilla leaned in but didn't speak. Johnson added, if you want to act early, that's fine. But don't call it science if you can't track the results. Barrasso paused, letting the point sink in. Raskin leaned forward, voice sharper. You're not looking for answers. You're trying to discredit consensus. This kind of talk gives fuel to oil companies who've blocked real change for decades. Kennedy turned slowly. Consensus isn't the same as proof. And if asking how $6 trillion was spent makes me a threat to your narrative, then maybe the science isn't built on evidence. It's built on funding. A ripple moved through the press. Barrasso leaned in. This isn't about campaigning, it's about accountability. Kennedy nodded and displayed a new chart. Carbon emissions from boreal forest fires in 2021. In one season, he said, these fires released double the CO2 the global economy did in 2001. And yet, we're being told that $1.2 trillion in subsidies will reverse that by 2030? He turned to Raskin. Is this science or a superstition with a price tag? Raskin clenched his jaw, saying nothing. Behind Kennedy, the chart glowed. Bold red lines set against the jagged black Vostok graph. Each rise and fall marked long past. Climate changes. Kennedy moved from the podium into the open floor. 5 separate cycles, he said, pointing. Temperatures rose, then carbon increased every single time. This goes back over 400,000 years. But we're acting like carbon caused the warming, not the other way around. He looked across at the Democrats. If cause and effect still matter, then this chart matters. And if it doesn't, then nothing we're doing makes sense. The room was still. Jaime Raskin adjusted his glasses and leaned into his microphone. Senator Kennedy is presenting a tempting misrepresentation. The Vostok data is interesting, yes, but it doesn't disprove the science behind current atmospheric changes. We are not living in the Pleistocene. Kennedy responded without hesitation. Then explain why your climate models ignore this history. Why every chart used to justify $6 trillion in spending relies on one future prediction, and not a single long-term record. Raskin spoke louder now. Because that historic delay doesn't mean CO2 isn't causing current changes. Today's system is different. The feedback loops are faster. The stakes are higher. These aren't cave drawings. These are collapsing ecosystems. Johnson leaned forward. That's a clever line, but here's the real question. If this long-term data shows CO2 doesn't drive warming, then why are we building policy around that assumption? Padilla answered cautiously. Because modern emissions are at levels never seen in these natural cycles. The models we use reflect the urgency of this change. Kennedy walked slowly back to his seat. Urgency isn't proof, and calling something unprecedented doesn't mean it's unnatural. It just means we haven't recorded it yet. He held up a folder. This is a technical review signed by independent climate experts. Many of them were blocked from publishing in peer-reviewed journals just because their findings challenged IPCC assumptions. He looked directly at Raskin. We don't have a consensus. What we have is censorship. Raskin's voice sharpened. We have a scientific process, peer review, repeatable results. What we don't have is time for political games disguised as analysis. Kennedy didn't blink. What we're missing is transparency. Who gets published? Who gets silenced? That's a system worth questioning. Johnson added calmly. We'd like this document entered into the record. Barrasso nodded from the chair. So entered. Kennedy turned back to the screen. This isn't guesswork. These are ice core records from Antarctica. Not opinions. They're the Earth's own record. He paused, letting that settle. Then, tapped the desk. Now let's hear from those no one wants to acknowledge. He unfolded a printout filled with signatures. A handwritten note was clipped to it. Suppressed in 2022. Kennedy's voice stayed even. 1,800 scientists, 2 Nobel Prize winners. All of them say the same thing. There is no climate emergency. The words landed like a weight. In the room, no one moved. Only the soft hum of the projector filled the silence. On the witness table, the list of names sat, dozens, then hundreds, linked to universities, labs, and research centers. Kennedy continued, the public was told to trust the science. Well, here's the science. Environmental statisticians, geologists, physicists, all saying the same thing. The press gallery rustled. One reporter paused mid-sentence. Johnson tapped the desk. This declaration? We submitted it last year. It was ignored. Raskin leaned forward, his face tense. That's not science. That's a publicity stunt dressed as research. It wasn't published in any recognized journal. It's ideology, not evidence. Kennedy remained calm. You mean it wasn't accepted by journals funded by the same networks that benefit from climate panic? Raskin raised his voice. No, I mean it didn't meet the standard of scientific review. Johnson cut in. Consensus isn't truth. Galileo didn't have consensus either. The room stirred again. Padilla tried to redirect. Scientific integrity matters. Any group can collect signatures. But without peer review, they don't influence policy. Kennedy leaned closer. Then why not review them, invite them in, challenge them, prove them wrong, don't bury them? Raskin shot back. Inviting denialists doesn't bring balance. It turns back the clock. Barrasso interrupted for the first time, calm but direct. Let's clarify. Has any federal agency reviewed this declaration? Have any major institutions responded? Silence. Kennedy spoke again, his voice steady. The answer is no. No agency has responded because it's easier to ignore 1,000 experts than to consider they might be right. He gestured toward the media. You're watching this because taxpayers were left out of the conversation. $6 trillion spent, and not one mention of this document on any major news outlet. Johnson opened his laptop and projected a chart onto the screen. It gets worse. The image displayed carbon emissions from boreal wildfires across Russia, Canada, and Alaska in 2021. This is how much CO2 nature released in 1 year, double the amount released by all human activity in 2001. He turned to Raskin. And we're being told that spending $1.2 trillion will offset just a third of that by 2030? Raskin didn't respond. His jaw was tight, hands clenched. Kennedy didn't look at him. He was already placing another document on the table, SNO. The data doesn't match the model. They don't adjust the model, they ignore the data. The lights dimmed slightly as a new chart appeared. Johnson leaned in. This one speaks for itself. The chart was simple. On the left, emissions reduction goals under the Inflation Reduction Act by 2030. On the right, emissions from boreal wildfires in 2021. The red bar, representing nature, towered over the green one, exposing the contrast. Johnson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The data shows that what nature did in 1 season released 3 times the emissions your policy plans to remove over 8 years. He looked toward the Democratic bench. So what exactly are we paying for? Padilla responded carefully. Wildfires are made worse by climate change. Reducing human emissions is still a critical part of the solution. Kennedy stood up. No one lives in those forests. No one started those fires. And yet you expect the American worker to pay $1.2 trillion to undo something caused entirely by nature. Something that will happen again. He walked back to his desk. This isn't about solving problems. It's about shaping how the public sees them. Raskin exhaled hard. We're trying to save the planet. You're defending fossil fuel corporations. The room tightened. A reporter adjusted his camera to capture the moment clearly. Kennedy paused before responding. I'm trying to protect the truth. You're trying to sell fear as virtue. Johnson joined in. And what's the plan when the next wildfire tops this one? Spend another $1 trillion. Tax every farmer, truck driver, and factory worker just to say we did something, even if it changes nothing? Raskin answered. If we don't act now, we risk losing everything. Kennedy stared at him. Then explain why the trillions we've already spent haven't cooled the planet or restored one burned tree. The screen changed again, this time to a satellite image of thick smoke swirling over the Arctic. The caption, Boreal Fire Season 2021, largest carbon event in decades. Padilla shifted uncomfortably. Johnson didn't let up. This isn't just ineffective, it's misleading. While you push $1 trillion promises, the reality burns, without permission, without pause. Barrasso remained quiet, but the mood in the chamber had shifted. Staffers stopped typing. Phones buzzed silently. The energy in the room changed. Raskin looked down at his phone but didn't pick it up. Kennedy placed a new document on the table, slow and deliberate. This isn't debate anymore. This is now part of the record. As he prepared the next set of evidence, the room seemed colder. Senator Kennedy reached under the table and placed a laminated chart beside the microphone. The title read, Global Food Dependency, Fertilizer Production by Fuel Source. In the center, one number was circled in red, 4 billion. That's how many people rely on ammonia-based fertilizers made using natural gas, he said slowly. Take that away and you disrupt food supply chains across half the world. He looked straight at Raskin. So before you push another plan to eliminate carbon, I have just one question. What do you plan to feed them with? Raskin adjusted his microphone. Senator, no one is suggesting an immediate end to natural gas. Kennedy's voice sharpened. Not immediate, but you've already shut down pipelines, blocked refineries, and sanctioned the very tools that keep people alive. You just frame it in softer language for speeches. Johnson added, you call it a transition, but you never say how, and certainly never say who will suffer while you figure it out. Padilla tried to respond. It's a phased approach, a just transition. With enough investment, we can move towards sustainable agriculture. Kennedy didn't blink. There's no such thing as a just famine, and no amount of repackaged language will make that reality more acceptable. Raskin spoke again, slower this time. This is a moral crisis. Climate justice requires sacrifice. History will remember who stood up. Johnson leaned forward. History remembers hunger, not hashtags. The press gallery stirred. Barrasso leaned back in his chair, watching silently. No one touched their coffee. No one whispered to aides. The silence had weight. Kennedy pointed at another number. Every climate speech ends with a slogan. But this, he said, tapping the chart, this ends in starvation. Raskin shook his head. You're framing it as though doing nothing is the answer. Johnson responded immediately. We're not doing nothing. We're doing the math. And the numbers say, without fossil fuels, 4 billion people starve. There was a beat of silence. Kennedy leaned forward, measured and direct. You don't get to take that risk. Padilla looked away. Raskin pressed his lips into a line, saying nothing. Johnson added one more line. If your transition requires global starvation, then maybe it's not a transition. It's a disaster in disguise. Barrasso lifted his gavel, not to strike, but to signal the weight of the moment. The chamber wasn't tense from conflict, but from realization. Kennedy quietly closed the folder in front of him. You asked us to imagine a better future, he said. We're reminding you that billions still live in the present. Before Raskin could reply, before Padilla could offer another carefully worded response, Kennedy pulled out a new file. Inside were photos, damaged homes, flooded basements, elderly residents standing waist-deep in water, holding groceries above their heads. Raskin leaned forward and spoke in a restrained tone. That's my neighborhood, Annapolis, September. The water was up to the mailboxes. He pointed to another image. Hurricane debris scattered over a collapsed porch. I've watched the season shift. I've seen tides breach seawalls that stood for generations. This isn't theory, it's homes, it's families. He turned to Kennedy. You sit with spreadsheets and fertilizer charts. I'm talking about funerals. The room fell into stillness. A few reporters leaned in, sensing the change in tone. Raskin's voice now carried more weight. We can't afford delay because it's inconvenient. We act because hesitation is fatal. Kennedy waited, letting him finish. Then he replied calmly. Storms have always come, Senator. What's changed is what's in their path. More buildings, more value, more exposure. That's not climate. That's consequence. Raskin clutched his clipboard. You think this is about insurance claims? He asked. Kennedy responded. What people see on the news isn't always because nature got stronger. It's because there's more to lose now. More homes, more development, more media coverage. That doesn't prove the climate changed, it proves exposure increased. Ron Johnson stood and held up a report. This is from the Congressional Budget Office. It adjusts for GDP and shows that per capita, hurricane losses have barely changed since 1950. He looked toward Raskin. What's changed is how we cover it. And how many people now live in risky areas. Padilla looked down. Markey stayed silent. Raskin tried again. What about sea level rise? My home state, Maryland, has over 7,000 miles of vulnerable coastline. Kennedy stepped toward the screen. Do you know how much the Gulf Coast has risen since the last ice age? Raskin shook his head. I don't care about what happened. 20,000 years ago, Kennedy didn't flinch. About 390 feet, that's called geologic time. So my question is simple. Do you believe anything humans do can stop the forces that caused that? Raskin didn't respond. Kennedy continued. Those same natural forces, plate tectonics, orbital cycles, ocean temperature shifts, they don't ask for congressional approval. Johnson added, we can't stop nature by spending trillions, but we can bankrupt families trying. Raskin's expression narrowed. So your answer is to do nothing? Kennedy walked slowly back to the microphone. Our answer is to tell the truth and stop using fear as leadership. The press cameras clicked. Johnson folded a newspaper quietly. Then Kennedy spoke again, clearly and without hesitation. $6 trillion. That's what we've spent. And after all of it, the core questions still stand. How much cooler is the Earth today? What exactly did that money buy? No one responded. Padilla glanced at the floor. Raskin took a deep breath but stayed quiet. Kennedy placed another document on the table and opened it. Inside were climate models, highlighted pages, cross-referenced, agency notes, and temperature projections. These are the models used to justify all federal climate spending under the Inflation Reduction Act. He looked directly at Padilla. Can you tell this committee who verified these models? Padilla hesitated. The IPCC model framework is a collaborative process built on international consensus. Kennedy didn't look away. So no external audit. Johnson stepped in. We expect private companies to audit every decimal in their reports, but this multi-trillion-dollar policy framework runs entirely on self-approval. He raised another report. Where's the stress test? Where's the error margin? Where's the independent review? Raskin crossed his arms. These aren't just projections. They're built on the best available science. They're not competing guesses. They're unified models. Kennedy replied, if they're so reliable, then why don't the projections from 2005 or 2010 match what actually happened? He turned toward the press. Sea levels didn't rise as quickly. Temperatures plateaued. Emissions forecasts missed. Entire regions. He paused. The models were wrong, but the money kept flowing. Padilla said nothing. Markey finally spoke softly. The public doesn't need every technical breakdown. What they need is leadership. Johnson cut in. No, the public needs the truth, not a blindfold printed with a slogan. Barrasso stayed silent, watching as the conversation shifted. Raskin tapped his pen on the desk. Kennedy took the chance. Senator Raskin, can you tell this committee how much of the Inflation Reduction Act's benefits depend on these same models? No reply. Kennedy pressed. 80%? 90%? Still no answer. Kennedy paused, then continued. So we've built national energy, agriculture, and tax policy on projections no one here has verified, peer-reviewed, or questioned under real scrutiny. Raskin leaned into his mic. If this hearing is just a way to attack scientists, then say it clearly. Kennedy kept his voice even. This isn't about attacking science. It's about holding people accountable when they present certainty without evidence. Johnson stood. If your solution can't survive basic questions, then it's not a solution. It's just belief, not science. The atmosphere in the chamber grew heavier. A staffer in the back quietly closed her laptop. Barrasso remained still, observing. Kennedy looked back toward Raskin. When belief replaces data, we stop governing. We start worshipping. Raskin stayed silent. Markey didn't move. Padilla stared at the desk. The screen behind Kennedy went black. The silence now said more than any argument. What had been a heated debate was turning into something else, an unraveling. Kennedy slowly placed another document on the table, unfolding it with care. It was a collection of highlighted forecasts, projections, and government references. He spoke clearly. These are the federal climate models used to justify the Inflation Reduction Act. Every graph, every emissions curve, and every degree of projected warming comes from the same base, IPCC. AR6, he turned toward Padilla. Senator, who checked their work? Padilla hesitated again. It's based on a shared international process, a consensus approach. Kennedy didn't look away, so still no audit. Johnson stepped closer. Private businesses undergo financial audits. Their projections get reviewed down to the decimal. But a multi-trillion-dollar climate policy, that gets approved on self-reporting. He held up another file. Where's the alternate model? Where's the performance history? Where's the error margin? Raskin responded sharply. Those models are made using the best available data. They're reviewed by scientists worldwide. Kennedy replied calmly. If that's true, then why didn't earlier projections match reality? Why did sea levels rise slower than expected? Why did global temperatures level off instead of accelerating? Why did emission scenarios miss entire regions? He gestured to the press. The models didn't match outcomes, but that didn't stop the funding. Padilla looked down. Markey broke his silence. People don't need to understand every technical detail. They just need leadership. Johnson responded quickly. No, what they need is clarity, not a slogan, not a photo. Real numbers, real facts. Barrasso remained silent, letting the exchange unfold. Raskin's tone softened. His words came slower now. If you want to launch an attack on climate science, then say that's what this is. Kennedy didn't raise his voice. It's not an attack. It's a call for accountability, for evidence, for transparency. Johnson added, if questioning a prediction equals denial, then it was never science. It was doctrine. The silence that followed lingered. A staff member in the press section lowered her notepad. Barrasso finally spoke, his voice low but clear. Let the record show that no direct answer was given to Senator Kennedy's question. Kennedy took a breath, then added, when belief replaces measurement, we stop legislating. We start preaching. No response from Raskin. Markey didn't move. Padilla stayed quiet. The screen behind them remained black. The silence was louder than anything else. As the screen faded to black behind him, Kennedy stood still. The hearing was no longer a debate. It had become a quiet breakdown of assumptions. The room, once tense with anticipation, now felt still, like a verdict had been delivered without needing to be spoken. Chairs sat half empty. Staffers began gathering papers in silence. Barrasso glanced at the committee clock, tapped the gavel once and said, this hearing is now adjourned. All exhibits will be sealed, and full documentation will be forwarded to the appropriate oversight offices. The bright lights dimmed. Raskin remained seated, staring forward, as if searching for a defense in the space between evidence and consequence. Padilla leaned to a staffer, whispering something. Johnson left his folder open on purpose. The last page showed just one line, printed in bold. No measurable climate impact verified. Across the table, Kennedy stood slowly. He didn't look at Raskin. Instead, he looked directly into the camera lenses, capturing every second. His voice was calm, Unrushed, intentional. No one in this room is denying climate change, he said. But someone in this country will have to answer for denying the truth. He paused, then continued. Each word deliberate. We spent $6 trillion, we passed laws, we changed our economy, we taxed workers, we punished industries, and yet not. One person has answered the only question that started this hearing. He stepped forward, his voice sharper now. What did we buy? How many degrees did we lower? Who did we save? And who did we leave behind? Behind him, the screen flickered briefly, then shut off. Johnson joined him at the table, holding up a flash drive between his fingers. We'll submit this summary to the Appropriations Committee, he said plainly. And if no action follows, the voters will submit their own. Barrasso stood and added quietly, the record is closed. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The weight in his voice signaled that the formal discussion was over, but the consequences were not. The cameras captured the last image. Kennedy powering down the projector. The Vostok chart folded away with a soft mechanical hum. The flash. Drive was placed inside a plain brown envelope, unmarked, unsigned. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken behind the Capitol dome. Streetlights flickered on. Protesters had gathered in small groups. Some held signs demanding green energy. Others responded, "Audit the trillions." This was no longer a debate. It was now a moment of reckoning. Kennedy paused on his way out. He turned around once, looking back at the seat where Raskin had sat. Empty now, he spoke, not to the chamber, but to the audience beyond the walls. Truth doesn't expire, he said, and it doesn't bow to consensus. Then he turned, walked to the door, and left. Behind him, the room emptied out. Quietly, finally. The door closed with a soft, firm click, like the sound of something finished, something sealed.